Are the ideas of science at odds with a humanist approach? Can we solve all the big problems with big data and analytics? Can you really succeed with tools and practices, but not understand the philosophy behind them? Hey, it's Andrew, and this is Safety on Tap. Since you're listening in, you must be a leader wanting to grow yourself and drastically improve health and safety along the way. Welcome to you. You're in the right place. If this is your first time listening in, thanks for joining us and well done for trying something different to improve. And of course, welcome back to all of you wonderful regular listeners. The healthcare industry is one of the biggest growing in many economies around the world. As population continues to explode, more people are living longer, and advances in medical care and pharmaceuticals are preventing more and more illness and death than ever before. Dr. Satyan Chari has been hard at work in this sector for many years, and I've been trying to get him on the podcast for ages. He's a great communicator, has done some really cool collaborative improvement projects, and he's always struck me as someone who knows his stuff, but is anything but a know-it-all. Been a long time coming, and this one's a little longer than usual. I hope you enjoy. Here's Satyan. Satyan Chari, welcome to the Safety on Tap podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I probably should have addressed you as Dr. Satyan Chari.
My dad's Dr. Satyan Chari. It's just, I know Dr. Chari sort of is not, I've never really grown into that. Always gives me, weird feels, but yeah, I do have a PhD, but that's sort of by and large.
Is that one of those things where the discussion is it's not a real PhD? I don't tell people on aeroplanes that I'm a doctor kind of thing, or is it?
Yeah, it's not a real doctor. Yeah, it's a real PhD. It's just not a real doctor. Although people would say that the PhD is a real doctor and,
doctors'
medical degrees aren't necessarily. Yeah, but no, it's not. I mean, it's one of those things that I did as part of the journey, but I've never sort of aspired to be an expert, with the title. It's part of my explorations into the stuff that I was interested in led to a PhD, but I don't necessarily use that in my day-to-day too much. So it's not something that I hear that often in my normal course of work. But yeah, it's fine. You can call me Dr. Chari if you are.
No, that's fine. I'm happy to roll with it. It's going to be relevant for the conversation. So tell me, there's probably a couple of words that I find most interesting when you talk and when I have a look at the work that you've done in the past. And you and I were talking about having a podcast conversation for the Safety on Tap audience, probably 5 or 6 years ago, I think. So I've been following you for at least that long. And some of the words,
and vice versa. I've been seeing your stuff as well. So yeah.
Very cool. So let's see if we can kind of join some dots for people. You've been a scientific advisor. You've been the head of a thing called Bridge Labs. You've worked in clinical excellence, in healthcare improvement, and every now and again, safety kind of pops up in the conversation as well. So my first question for you, I suppose, is what's the connection between the Safety on Tap audience and their work in workplace health and safety and the work that you do, which has some of these other labels?
So I've done a lot of different things, it's been a really interesting journey. For me, it started, I guess my core identity is I'm an occupational therapist, right? So that's something I hold very close. And every chance I get to highlight the fact that, a lot of what I'm doing currently still connects back to an early training as an occupational therapist. The focus is always on designing for human beings as part of work they do, the things that motivate them. It's always been a very humanistic foundation. And that's sort of taken me on this journey that went into occupational rehab, physical ergonomics, done a lot of work in the health and safety space early on, but then into patient safety and in improvement and, saved me overseas, brought me back. And I think it all connects, I think at the end of it, I'm always amazed by how much commonality there is between the work that I do, whether it's in healthcare or in the health and human services, or I find someone who's looking on in an industry that you think there's very little connection, but it's the same issues, it's the same problems, and solutions, but the responses that people are adopting these days also tend to have some commonality. So Yeah, I've done a whole bunch of stuff. We can dive into it, into specific aspects of that. But for me, it's the shift in the air in terms of how we regard human beings and groups of people and trying to work productively and how we work with them productively.
Hmm.
And
When you say we, who do you mean by we?
everyone,
Okay.
I think I was watching one of your talks, might have been the one when our colleague was over here and might have been on safety clutter, one of those.
Yeah.
And the other thing you said something that really resonated with me around the fact that we call ourselves safety professionals, this, that, and the other. But at the heart of it, we're change professionals.
Yeah.
Oh, we're in the business of change, something to that effect. And and I guess that's what it is. There's a lot of people trying to bring positive change to a whole range of things, sometimes under the banner of safety, sometimes under things. But the core approaches and methods really get down to it, and underneath the labels, they're very similar. And I think that's the stuff that really fascinates me and motivates me. That's the stuff I'm bringing into healthcare at the moment. I do teach a lot and I share on, technical knowledge, technical skills with people who are in the business of change making in healthcare.
Hmm.
But I'm always trying to deconstruct it back down to, so what's your agency? What can you do at the moment? It's not about the next factor or the next bit of information that, will suddenly make it all clear. It'll never be all clear. So how do you work productively in what you've got now?
Yeah.
Uh, and that's the sort of stuff that really interests me. And yeah, we can, pick into some of that.
Well, I love it. And I think for me, it picks up on a couple of things that are what I'm getting clearer on, labeling as kind of conceptual things. So, for example, the connection between safety and healthcare quality, then we have to talk conceptually about, okay, well, what is safety and whose safety are we talking about? I remember talking with Eric Holnagel, now that you've mentioned him, and I found it interesting that he had conceptually described safety as not the absence of negatives, but the presence of things going well. And he says that deliberately. He says it's not about positives, even though people often say the word positive. And I said to him, well, you must, from a human psychology point of view, have had a look at the area of, Seligman's work and positive psychology. Like that's conceptually very aligned. And he said, oh, I haven't looked at it. So I find that really interesting when we come up with a conceptual ideas. And then there's all these adjacents that exist out there. And we go, oh, that seems similar. That seems similar. And we can learn a whole lot from those, even though the subject matter or the industry context or the specific work might not be always the same. So I appreciate that. And I wonder for you, um, I think my question is, what have you reconceptualized in your professional work as you've gone along that journey you described for us? What have you changed your mind about either definitionally or conceptually as you've gone along to make you successful?
Oh, to make me successful. I was ready with an answer, at least to make you
Oh,
successful.
okay.
So, well,
Can you
I
give
was
us,
like, I don't
okay.
know if I'm successful. I define success as slaying the dragon, which is, actually seeing change at scale in healthcare, which hasn't happened. And so
Okay.
in some ways, I've had micro successes and things that I'm proud of, but it's still a journey. But I will say, as far as changing my mind goes, I have changed my mind quite substantially. And in fact, and this is often the story I'll tell is that, well, in some ways, it's a convenience story. It's never as clean as that. Like I was saying initially, having trained as an occupational therapist, when we do an assessment with someone, first question we ask is, well, what are your felt needs? What do you actually want to gain out of this? The basis is never, let's look at your neuromuscular, let's, the assessment is not the foundation. The first thing is what's important to you and what do you want to get out of it? So for me, that's been, I think, a shaping influence in how I've thought about things. But
Mhm.
that said, you know, when I went into patient safety, I was really sucked in by this notion that we can, you know, save the world through randomized control trials. And it was that I really bought into it. In fact, look at some of my research papers early on. Not that I'm saying that they're not worth reading. I mean, they do add something, but they're all about regression analysis and looking at, cutting data 25 different ways, trying to understand what signals might lie in there. And I went down that path, ran randomized control trials,
Mm.
and really had to have this, real turning point where I realized that this rationalist mechanistic way of thinking about how the world works has very little value. And I've kind of gone to the point where, some people will say that I take more of an extreme view, sort of not even, I have really very little time for that way of approaching change in healthcare. I'm
Mhm.
very much about, person-centered, ecological, bottom-up type stuff, which really interests me. And I've seen that work in practice. But for me, that's been the big shift. Big shift has been realizing that there's this myth of measurability is pulling too much. Well, it's not a myth. I guess this future, the utopian promise that through measurability and data will solve some of these big things. That I think has sucked too much energy and oxygen out of, doing positive work. That's the first thing. The second thing is this idea that, and as someone who's done a lot of training in my life, trained a lot of people, also trained my, undertaken a lot of training. I still think we sometimes implicitly give the sense that unless you have this knowledge, you're not part of the club. Or you unless you have this knowledge, you cannot do something useful where you are now. And
Yeah.
that's completely, I think I reject that completely, because people have been doing, like, you look at social movements of the world, people have done amazing things. Groups of people have done amazing things. And there's been circumstance and opportunity there. But, if you look at any movement that's lasted for over 100 years, never come with a project plan. It's never come with injection of funds, stuff that's stuck around has been people getting, together, making themselves fully available to the problems at hand and having attractive things and then moving forward. So
Yeah.
we shouldn't create this. Healthcare is it's very elitist in the sense of, the smartest, it's often the smartest people in societies tend to end up in healthcare. And so there's real push towards, well, you got to have a ticket. It involves having all these things before your opinion counts. And I think the sorts of problems we have, everybody needs to get active and start working on things. And so I do a lot of work on trying to get people to find their agency in trying to create change in the here and now.
Yeah.
And I've found myself pulling back to core principles. And, understand the final differences between, the equivalence of successes and failures and all of that. And I use a lot of safety tools in my own work, but often what excites me is, I'm working with people thinking, well, how do you make this real for the people who are doing the work without having to put them on this 2-year journey of, you
Okay.
know, paradigm shift. And when I find some of those things, it really does excite me. And a lot of my work's been in that space. So I guess that's what's making things successful. I've had my own shifts, my own epiphanies, but these days I'm really focused on helping people find ways to be productive in the here and now. And that means configuring my toolkit slightly differently to what it was even a couple of years ago.
It sounds like it's more than slightly differently, though. I mean, you described philosophically kind of two ends of almost the opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of rationalist, which is like we can understand everything, logic will solve all the problems. Mechanistic, which is that we can break everything down in parts and we can understand the parts and then put them back together in ways that make the machine work better. Versus the humanist, you mentioned ecological approaches as well. So it sounds like that's not a minor change.
Yeah, no, that was the big change. But I think even if you sort of zoom into the humanist ecological side, even that peels into a bit of a spectrum, because on one hand, I know you had Gemma on recently, and I practice human practice. Even within the human factors, so the umbrella, you have people who have a focus on, high fidelity analytical approaches
Mhm.
to try and, understand problems. Complex problems need to be understood first before you. Well, I mean, there's an assumption that complex problems need to be understood first before you can do anything about it. I mean, and I think that in some situations that is the case. In other situations, you can only understand that complex problem by probing it, by doing something about the complex problem, because the data you have about that complex problem is always incomplete. And
Yeah.
so that's a spectrum in itself. So you've got two ways of dealing with complexity. One leads to, investment in analysis and understanding, which is never time wasted. The other is about, creating eliciting some behavior from that complex system, the complex problem. If we then understand, well, what's that telling me? And that's more interactional, a more interpersonal way of understanding complexity. And I think even those two, you have groups that will tend to, would slant more left and some will slant more right. And I think there's been within the systems thinking complexity type arena where there's a lot of change. And I've been moving more and more towards what can a person who's an embedded practitioner within some, work, was much part of not the problem, but the situation in which the problem lives. So in some ways connected to the problem. And healthcare, most things are bigger than you. It's rarely anything that you got. And people like to talk about the human factors examples. Oh yeah, well, there's this piece of, this syringe and then this connector, and then we brought this engineering solution where that can connect to this, and lo and behold, the problem went away. Yeah, great. That happens sometimes. Most of the time, but that's a very simple, you don't get those kinds of simple wins. You have lots more complexity attached
Yeah.
to it.
Yeah.
And so it becomes, it almost paralyzes people and I've had this conversation with, and I jumped over at the Sunshine Coast University's Human Factors Center with Paul Salangella. And, we do like an axiomat analysis where we train people, we build axiomat of some case study. And then you look at, people are identifying what the contributing factors are, and you get a bit of a sense of what the system that sits behind those issues is. And I'll often just to be the black hat, we'll often say, so, right, so you've got this amazing analysis, and now I'm giving this to, the health and safety guy and say, here you go, here's what the issues are, and here's, the legislative contribution, and here's the contribution between shore operations and all of those issues. Now go and be productive. And I say, what do they do next?
What are they exactly?
And
After their head explodes and they pick up all the pieces.
yeah, what do they do next? And it's like, well, and this is the issue is that in some ways, I mean, no one really talks about this, but systemic analyses almost rob agency out of people because saying, well, the problem's way bigger than you.
Yeah.
And I think for me, that's been a bit of a slow realization is that the problems of the past have been in healthcare, for instance, have been, we focused on medical error, we focused on, root cause analysis, and we've done things that have given us very superficial insights that don't actually fix deeper problems.
Yeah.
But the realization that our deeper problems hasn't necessarily led to people fixing them either. So and for me, that's the sort of slight shift that I'm talking about is that if we aren't going to be able to, press pause and redesign from first principles again in big, complex entities like healthcare, then what is the alternative? Like having an insight into what complexity lies behind what seems to be a superficial problem should still allow us to then do something productive with that, with the skills that we have, with the networks that we've got, the influence that we can wield. There's got to be some sort of productive next step. Otherwise it's pointless, And so that's my shift is I've not sort of shift as much of a taken a specific focus that I think is really important. That if you get that right, people can start going on a journey because this is often what I'd say. People will ask me, what are sort of your 5 rules of human factors? And I often don't tend to make lists of things, especially if you've got people who haven't got background in science. But I'll often say that, if you're running a project, it doesn't matter where you start, but you've got to stick around to understand that it's not going the way you wanted it. And you're there, stick around to learn the lessons that experience wants to teach you. And if you're there, you'll get to wherever you want to get to at the end of that. But if you don't stick around to learn those lessons, you keep making the same mistakes again. So it's not about starting absolutely right, because you will learn things along the way that you didn't know when you started. It's really about being able to have the openness and the humility, but also, the frames of reference you need to be able to understand when something's not going as you want it to go. Make sense of that.
Yeah.
And I found that those sorts of things I find have been more beneficial to helping practitioners in the field than saying, all right, let's talk about, emergence or sets of dependence on initial conditions and, complexity theory and those kinds of things. That's cool. I love that stuff. But for me, it's like, it actually takes away people's agency when you take them down that path, because we tell them that everything you knew was wrong, and what you need to know is still further out of your reach than at the moment. I think that's not necessarily used.
Absolutely. And I think I've just kind of joined the dots between a couple of concepts that you've talked about here that I think capture quite nicely, not perfectly, but nicely, some of this discussion we're having that contrasts old ways of working, especially in the sense of your professional journey, and then what you're currently doing. So, like this idea about robbing agency. And then I kind of noted down here about loss of control. Now, the way that I think about that is that like agency is about an individual actor, an individual person's sense of their ability to actually make change and make decisions and influence what goes on in the world. But loss of control, I think about is more like it's a system, little s system approach. So when you talk about data, for example, the problem with big data issue or the analysis that comes out of it is that people lose agency because they say, this is too hard for my brain to process and comprehend. So then agency goes down. They feel like what can I do about this? How can I understand this? And then in the system level, people feel like, or managers of the system and processes in the system feel like they're losing control because it's too big and it's too messy and it's too misunderstandable or non-understandable. So I feel like those two concepts that I kind of joined together, that we have this unintended side effect of these great ideas from gurus like Holnagel or out of complexity, people like Dave Snowden and whatnot, or even, you know, older thinkers around organizational learning. And I find that's really interesting because we run headlong into these ideas. Like people say, give me the tactic, group learning in an operational sense. And then they don't think about, oh, but hang on a second. We just totally disempowered middle managers in their role in decision making. Or we haven't anticipated the fact that the system will expect a form of record keeping, data analysis, and overall kind of roll up of that. So I love the fact that you're kind of highlighting the fact that we make one change over here. It has this unintended side effect over here, because that's actually the space, that's the change space that we play in. But that's perfectly describing the approach to change that we're talking about.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, you put it together really beautifully, because I identify with practitioners, and that's the reason why I was kind of shying away from the whole PhD thing, because I did that, and that was my phase when I was very much about, we'll solve things through randomized control trials. And so in some sense, I've learned about research and how to do research and, the kinds of research that happen. I've learned about research that's happening in patient safety, but in a sense, I don't really pull from any of those learnings too heavily when I go. But the frustrating, so I identify with, the work of the doing as more so than, and for me, the science is always means to an end. It's never the end in itself. And so, and it's great that people out there who are motivated by advancing their theory. And, as Drew often will say, nothing more practical than a good theory. And I completely agree that that's the case. But the issue that I find is that it's all those little things. So you live in an environment which is all metrified. It's driven by certain ways of thinking.
Yeah.
Those metrics have shaped how people think currently.
Yeah.
Within that, if you were to go and say, well, that's not useful, let's, this is what we need to be doing. You've got to then craft a journey from where you're at now to that point.
Meet them where they're at.
No one's really, and then in some sense that's unique to your own setting. And it's also where you're at now it might mean working with these teams more than that team, or it might mean, showing some benefit in disinvesting in from, this data point, most of the other one. That's all contextually dependent, but that's entirely what will define success or failure. And so I think giving people the tools to do that better is at least as important as, the sort of the end goal that you're trying to paint for a different way of operating, because getting to that different way of operating is, if you can't get there, then it's totally hypothetical, right?
Yeah.
And Drew, he talks about in safety class, which you obviously know much more about than I do because you present on it as well. But, he'll often use the example of ethics processes in healthcare as something that's being developed for research ethics reviews as a way of trying to prevent intrusive work of researchers within the operations of healthcare, but in itself has become a form of clutter. And he gives that as an example of something which is almost, an intervention aimed at reducing clutter in some ways, which is creating more clutter. So there's that complexity that sits there, which is where space that practitioners work in.
Yeah.
And I think, finding ways of not inadvertently creating this loss of control is really important. And,
But I
and I
wonder
think,
whether it's actually deliberate, like whether we actually need to go, there will be a feeling or a sense or an experience of loss of control. So if that's the case, what do we do about that? Let's do that bit deliberately. That's kind of my thought on it, because we have enough data in the sense of, like, even let's just combine your experience and my experience to say that it's reasonable that at some point in time that might happen for some people in the change process. So then let's anticipate that, and then let's make plans for that to anticipate how we might tackle that. Because I think the sense of loss of control is an inevitable part of the I was going to use the word dismantling. Maybe that's not the right word. The unpicking of the status quo that we've got right now, where, I mean, I love the fact that people will call gurus in, or they'll say to me, we just need to change people's minds. And then once we've changed their minds, then all management will be on board. And you go, okay, well, that's probably a good part of the change. Like, I'm not going to argue with that. But once they've changed their mind, sometimes what we do is we just drive discomfort up through the roof, because A, they have to let go of the status quo, and B, they're going into the unknown. So, like, let's do that bit deliberately, maybe. Let's do it with empathy and care and support. Hey, it's Andrew with a quick reflection about performance. No one wakes up in the morning thinking, I wish I had a coach for work. So it's pretty normal that coaching isn't a concept that's on your mind. What I do know is, from working with hundreds of health and safety professionals, what's more likely to be in your mind are the frustrations you might be feeling about making change, or the doubts you have about your ability to step up, or concerns you have about the capability of your team to better service the needs of your organization. Or maybe you're excited but unsure about your new promotion, that expanded responsibility, or how in the heck you'll develop and deliver that new health and safety strategy. These are the everyday things in the game of health and safety practice. Some good, some not so good. A coach is not on the field of play with you. They don't pass you the ball and tell you what to do. A coach helps you be ready for the game, to prepare a plan, to develop the skills or the capabilities for the next challenge, and support you through the losses as well as the wins. Coaching is not evaluated on your participation or the time spent. Coaching is only evaluated on its outcomes for you, and they can be pretty awesome. Coaching is one of the most effective forms of professional development I've ever seen. I have a long list of stories and people who I can put you in touch with to tell you exactly how they've benefited from coaching with me. And it's a pretty smart investment in valuable resources for you and your team. If you want to explore how coaching might help accelerate you and your team's success, visit www.safetyontap.com/curious.
yeah, I mean, I'm sure you had an experience as well. You go into a meeting and, you, especially when you've lived and breathed a certain way of thinking for a while, it becomes part of who you are. And, I'll have to catch myself saying things sometimes when I go into a group as a consultant, or, sometimes I'm working with my healthcare work, wherever it is, and I'll say, oh yeah, but there's sources of success and failures are the same as people making, trade-off decisions on uncertainty. I won't use those words necessarily, but, convey that message saying that I'm not that interested in what blew up. I'm more interested in your day-to-day work.
Yeah.
Because that's really what's driving all your performance, all your, your successful performance and all your broken performance. So let's start there. And it's challenging with people, they're not, it's not an easy. That's what I'm saying is, like, and without really quoting, this was a recent piece of work I did, but, I worked in an organization that was looking at their incident data and were quite concerned about a certain trend, and asked me to have a look at things. And, and I was like, yeah, that's fine. I'll look at the data. I'll do some of that work, but that's not what really motivates me. For me, it's really looking at telling you, how much resilience is there in the work that people are doing, and this brittleness there, what can be done about that. And through that work, when I, so finished that piece of work, one of the things that really jumped out at me was how much of that sense making of what really goes on at the higher levels that organization were connected to things that weren't connected to everyday work.
Yeah.
In fact, there was this, major gap between, how excellence was being produced in everyday work, how people are managing risk in everyday work, which is really apparent. You don't have to go on, forensic look at it. You just have to go and interact. And, very basic. You will see that. And the stories that the organization was selling itself about itself, which were quite pessimistic stories, which were in fact not founded in, because usually the other way around, it's usually people say fantastic stories and things are broken. I mean, this was kind of the other way around. It's like, you had no touch points to check that. It's the way people have been thinking about some of these things has just made those systems drift further and further away from the stuff that really matters. And, for some of us who understand this really well, when you go in, it's sort of, it's staring you in the face, but it's not the simplest thing to make those connections for people. You have to take them on a journey. And often we don't, like, when you look at, you speak to, setting it through, not so much because they're really focused on the real world experience of doing some of this stuff, but lots of other academics are pushing science forward. They just assume that gap just closes when you show enough of a contrast between A and B, and there's logic within the B way of doing things.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily give as much credence to the fact that this way of thinking now has built systems around it. And this way of thinking now, reinforces this way of thinking. And then to try to close that gap, it's even the smallest of things. It's not as simple as that, And so I think that's where a bit of the loss of control, loss of agency can come from, is people are saying, I'm seeing this differently and my organization sees this differently. But that journey that I need to take them on, I just don't have the ability to try and make that happen.
Yeah.
And so within that, I'll often, these days, I talk a lot about is some of Ralph Stacey's work, more recent, this later part of his work, which is around complex responsive organizing. I know that's really a great term, but it's really about finding your ability to act in the moment and responding productively. Things emerge out of that, as opposed to trying to establish, to analytically what that next step might be. And I find that seems to, certainly in healthcare improvement, healthcare patient safety, when people are talking about change making, that tends to be more empowering and enabling than, say, a normal school systems thinking, where looking at, say, build a causal diagram, see what's happening, what are your points of leverage, what can you weaken, what can you strengthen, rather than that saying, what are your networks like, who do you influence?
Yeah.
Where is the receptivity to this idea? Who will let you go a bit further? How do you manage people's anxieties within that situation? If you don't have the wiggle room to be able to try something out, how do you go and work on getting that wiggle room? That's a you thing. And those are the sorts of things that we leave as being implicit, but I think it's a good conversations to have, and saying, if you don't have that, how do you create that ability to be trusted in order to go and do some of that stuff?
Yeah. And I think you've described like a sense of creating cognitive dissonance. And I mean, I've taken a lot of insight and utility out of my work around change and supporting senior health and safety leaders and their teams to be more effective from marketing. That's one of the areas in the way that you describe some other disciplines. And it's funny because people often talk about cognitive dissonance, which is like the current state, and then paint an alternative, which is not where you're at right now. And then the theoretical, psychological or neurological effect is that people will move towards the other state in order to resolve it. But what people often don't understand is that the greatest force in cognitive dissonance is actually to keep things exactly as they are. The status quo is the status quo because it's really good at being the status quo. And I appreciate too that you kind of highlighted the fact that when you talk about complex responsive organizing, that almost becomes the thing that fits neatly in a box. It has an acronym and it replaces the systems or the bureaucracy that we have right now. So it's almost like you have to have a nice thing tied up in a bow to put into the cognitive dissonance space in order for people to feel comfortable to go, you know what, Satyan, you're right. We're happy to follow you down this pathway for a little bit because you've got something that looks like you've taken something away and then you've plugged something back in. Have I read that right? Am I on the track there?
Yeah. Yes. In some situations, yes. I mean, it's so contextual. And, when you're talking about a specific situation where the alternative is clear, then, often it is that cognitive dissonance that you create, and that becomes the catalytic thing that gets people moving on a journey. So that does happen often. That particular example that I told you about, when you just show people, hey, this is a storytelling about yourself. You know, here's exhibit A, exhibit B, exhibit C. I see excellence. You're seeing what's the, and that conversation is just a conversation. We're asking those questions, and then people will create their own journey. So absolutely. But the other thing is, when you have large scale problems, let's not pick something too big, but just, a pandemic rolls around.
Good example.
Yeah. It absolutely requires you to change how you work. Some of that stuff happens naturally because the structures that hold us in the business as usual way of working suddenly disappear.
Yeah.
And things that we think are important risks are no longer important risks because of the bigger risk in town. And that just creates an opportunity to respond in different ways. But
Uh-huh.
when you don't have, like, this is what I'm making is when you don't have a clear alternative, what does good look like in what's in front of us now? When we don't actually know that, a lot of our tools fall away. And I think in those situations, and that's what some of the complex responsive organizing type question comes in, was the future is really unknown, but you have to, current state doesn't work. How do you craft an innovation journey?
Mm-hmm.
And I think innovation is something we talk a lot more about. And I think this is one of the things that I have really discovered in the last couple of years with the Bridge Labs program that I was leading, where I've been working with designers. So let me tell you a little bit about that, just to put some context into it for the listeners. Is just when the pandemic started, I had the opportunity to launch a program which allowed for us to bring in external expertise that we lack in healthcare from the creative design disciplines, safety innovations, so Sydney and Drew, and human factors, and some Sunshine Coast, the team, Paul Salmon and Jill, to really try and bring them close to frontline problems and connect them to teams. This was experts, not here to tell you how to do things, but experts working with you on your problems. So you have that expertise on that, safety on that, expertise on that. And the whole model was really quick iterations of someone has a problem that they want to work on, in the context of this pandemic. And do they all their issues? They're motivated by it. Do we see value of bringing some of these skills in? Will that actually help them? Or is there something else that they need to look at first? And there's enough of a mix there. Within 2 or 3 days, we had teams there working with them, and so the idea was, so this is the question. What I'm making is, this was a bunch of different things they worked on, That first year was 30 odd projects across the state, 300 clinicians, almost the equal number of consumers of healthcare across the entire state. It would seem quite scattered up. You're doing all this stuff. So what? But what we found was, just by using the vehicle of those, let's call it points of intersection between, a clinical need, clinicians are passionate about it, and consumers that are passionate about addressing that, and giving them the resources and support to do it. Saw massive amounts of return from that. Like, the projects themselves were often quite successful. I mean, the backdrop of this is that a lot of change work, formalized top-down change work, was shut out as soon as the pandemic started, because people had to focus on the problems at hand. So in fact, a lot of the things that the larger organizations trying to run is under the banner of change, people thought was not useful to them.
Yeah.
And so people saying, the change fatigue, the change resistant at the moment, this is, people don't want to do change because they've got clinical work to do. On the other hand, we were getting sucked into these problems because, like, they saw us helping them deal with the issues that they had.
But the frontline people had capacity because the system wasn't driving change at them.
Maybe, but I think it was also to do with the fact that this frontline people are always pursuing change.
They know. That's right. They know. Yeah.
And so it's like, whatever seemed to be superfluous, redundant change, they're like, well, that's your priority. I would focus on this stuff. But what I guess what I'm saying is, in those situations, it was never about creating a future state where, well, you've all got to be innovative. So you want you to now stop doing what you're doing in this particular way and do that other thing. It was never about that. It was really about saying, how do we, within this ecology that exists, how do we offer in something that can create the innovation that's important to the system itself. And then out of that, let's see what emerges, So it's, in a sense, it's a kind of an intentional loss of control. It's saying, yeah, I don't know where this is going to go. We don't know if these are going to succeed. In fact, we don't care if they succeed. The idea, as it's brought to us, is enough of a criteria, and then we'll see what we learn out of it. And really, all we said, and we said this quite explicitly, so we knew this, is that we want to ask very simple questions. What does partnership look like at base? Is there enough of a common language that these people can actually collaborate? Do clinicians run, do creative designers run for their sanity as soon as they start talking to clinical people? Does that even work? We just think simple questions like that. We never in a million years thought that we'd have the kinds of impacts we saw, which was all these projects completed. We saw a lot of work move beyond that initial seed money we gave them. And often things you put like $10,000, you pull $1 million from competitive grants almost. There's some amazing things that came out of it. But also these relationships continued. So people saw the value of working with the QG Design Lab on create, things you would even think might have been opportunities for collaboration, from redesigning how we deliver medicines to incarcerated people, to providing better orthotics for people in regional communities, and just all sorts of things, co-designing with First Nations, people with chronic diseases on how they have a better telehealth experience. It was so amazing to see that each of these things then grew into collaborations that have continued on. In fact, by losing control, we gave people the opportunity to take control of these things.
Yeah.
And this idea, I think it's a really powerful idea, because we have this massive problem in health. I'm not sure what's like in other sectors, but sustainability is a massive problem. The day you take that dollar investment away, everything reverts back to how it was, Once you don't have the chain champion, everything reverts back to how it was. And there's a real snapback that happens. And we found that it's not in none of these situations that we have those issues, because really, it was really tying into the motivation that people existed there. So they were incentivized already to take that forward. So we've seen huge amounts of subsequent unfunded innovation come out of these things. So for me, it's really, within that situation, there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of, let's try it and have a crack at this. And it's easy to look back and say, oh, we won this award, we won that award, we've got it into this international document, and be very sophisticated about, oh yeah, we had it all planned out. This is exactly how it was meant to go, but it's not. And I think by design, going in and saying, we're going to be humble about this. It's really, we're going to go in and leave our agenda at the door, but it's really not about us. And allowing people to own things, take the wins, is such a crucial part of, if you're really motivated by success rather than personal benefit. Instead, if you define success as, problem that you're really keen to shift, you want to see it shifted, as opposed to you being celebrated for having had a role in that. I mean, that's key thing that people have to figure out for themselves. But if you're really motivated by seeing something lasting come out of your work, there's something in that, in being able, and it's, you don't like to talk about in the West, humility and all those kinds of things seem to be too, but I think these are key things that you can't just, it's not about portraying humility. You really have to be humble about how you, in your own knowledge and your own, and your reliance on others and the networks that you have, and the fact that nothing that you went in with is going to end up being the same. They say that quotes there, which is, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And there's lots of variants of that. And the enemy's complexity. It's not the enemy, it's reality.
Yeah.
That there's something in that process. So it's really that. It was not really so much of cognitive dissonance. It's about, for me, it's like, in order to be effective, there's all these things that you need to work on yourself before or after, but definitely at some point, it has to happen alongside the technical knowledge around safety, tools, resilience, engineering, human factors, whatever it might be. If you want to be productive within a group to create change that is greater than yourself, then there's a lot of other stuff that needs to also happen. And working on that intentionally is a really big part of this.
100%. And I think that's a beautiful way to kind of wrap up. You mentioned Ralph Stacey's work. around complex responsive organizing. Are there any other things that you would recommend as a parting gift for the Safety on Tap audience? Either concepts, models, theories, books, ideas that you would recommend people have a look at because you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think depending on how you're wired, I think there's different people you could read without naming names. That there's certain people within this applied complexity space, so very much it's my way or the highway. If you can read those authors with the sense that, yeah, that's their position, but I'm going to take something out of it and apply that to my greatest set of skills, then those are, those are good. I've kind of prefaced in the way when I can actually name what those authors are. But let me just say, okay, well, if you look at applied complexity, there's a lot of key names. I'd say some of the lesser known ones, which I think are useful for people who are interested in going down this journey and not making it too technical,
Yeah.
would be looking at soft systems methodology.
Okay.
So this is something I think that safety people it comes from the quality side of things, the soft systems methodology, which is, I think, one, it's been used very extensively in industry to create change where there's a social element to that. So systems thinking with this soft system method, check that out. My mentors, when I was on my fellowship in the US, I worked with someone called Paul Plisek, who he's not known outside of healthcare. And in fact, he's not very much known in healthcare. He was way ahead of his time. And at the start of the whole patient safety journey 20 years ago, he was talking about complexity and he's talking about innovation. And he'd often talk about creativity and innovation and complex nervous system in the same breath, and that's sort of something that's coming back now a bit more.
Yep.
And he talked about De Bono's theories and talked about a lot of work around how to create creativity and tap into creativity, guided creativity. His website used to be Guided Creativity. His book, he wrote this with Brenda Zimmerman called Edgeware, Edgeware. And it has a second part to it. It's really about innovation, which pulls from complexity theory. I found that that was one of my first introductions into this way of thinking. I went away from it for a long, and looked a lot of other stuff. And nowadays my practice is very aligned to that. And it's very funny. I think I sent him an email. He's retired now, but I just had to tell him that I've gone this full circle. And I knew he'd never see it. There was a cathartic thing for me to write this email to someone who's never going to open it because he doesn't, he's very blissfully retired. To really say that, it's come back to those core principles are really what it takes. Creativity, agency, innovation. So I think reading some of his work would be useful.
How did you spell Bob? How did you spell Bob's last name?
So Paul, Paul, Plisek, Plsek. And, he's got some of the stuff's out there. A lot of his research papers, things that he's written with other people are out there. I think that's worth looking at. And I think those are sort of the types that I think complex responsible organizing is not the easiest books within which Ralph Stacey talked about. They were not the most accessible for practitioners. So I'm reluctant to push them. But soft systems, I think, is a good way of really pulling out some of the core ideas within this. And even if I explained as there's the flux of everyday life. Within that, pushes out things as perceived as problematic situations. And within these problematic situations, you've got people who are working purposefully.
Yeah.
But they all have differing worldviews on things. And I know the worldview conceptualization people critique that anyway. So there are ways of thinking about things that may not align. And your work as a practitioner is really not about changing how they think about things, but really bringing about consensus on what is the future reality they might be able to live with. And then you move the conversation and the system process towards that. And then until the next problematic situation. That's really soft systems methods in a nutshell. And I think it explains a lot of what I do. It's you're just you're not trying to solve things, you're trying to alleviate problems. And the other person I'd say is Russell Lakoff. Anything you can find from Russell Lakoff, like Lakoff's amazing. listen to his YouTube videos, read his books, very accessible people that you can like quite directly. I think go there first.
And I think I've found Russ Akoff's work amazing in the sense that it's very accessible. His use of metaphor is excellent because he often deals with management teams and people who aren't the experts. And the way that he describes stories and case studies of, systems change and innovation, I think are absolutely beautiful. And in the back of my mind, whenever I read his stuff, I say to myself, speaking about other authors who are quite inflexible in their view of the world, I go, is his stuff still relevant? And when I try and put his ideas into practice, I tend to go, for a lot of circumstances, they are. So just because it's old doesn't mean that it's.
Oh, yeah. And I think sometimes reading that older stuff will give you an insight into a way of putting that together that's now been lost. And I find like, you go, so I'm sort of post systems thinking. I don't use systems thinking in its older form, but if you go back and read Donella Meadows' Thinking and Systems, great books. They're tiny. You get a free download because the Meadows Institute has a version of that you can download for free. And you read that, you read what she's saying, and you talk about behavior over time graphs and things that I don't really necessarily use that much, but the language that she's using is very humanist. It's very exploratory, appreciative. She talks about, you go into a village in some remote community and you talk to the older lady sitting in the village square and ask her about how the world works, and you get most of his systems thinking principles from her. And I'm like, zero in on that. Like that for me is like, well, this is common heritage. We know this stuff. We're going back to things that we've always known. Yeah. In some ways, some things that we've always known. And yes, the nature of research is that you have to be producing new things. And so we receive old wisdom in new forms all the time, but it's important to know that some of this is old wisdom. Because the more people have been saying this over time, the more likely this is some sort of a invariant truth about nature, reality, and human existence.
Validity. Yeah.
And so it's really important to go back to what people have been saying about over a longer period. So definitely, I think Russell Akoff is very relevant. And certainly the people who may have got aspects of it wrong, or perhaps talking about industry that was quite, linear and mechanical. And so they've spoken to certain things that, you don't agree with currently. We still learn from that. I mean, I don't read like Frederick Winslow Taylor, and we keep hammering Taylorism as being the worst thing. Sure, but there is elements of that are allowing us to have this conversation now. Taylorism brought us technology. So I think this being appreciative of various perspectives is such an important skill that I don't think is promoted enough. There's not enough. We don't see it in our opinion leaders. So we think we've got to pick a cap, and I'm like, I don't really have time for that. We've got to be more bridge builders, having conversations across these, and if you can't have this conversation, are you really any good as a practitioner?
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So those sorts of things, I think, for me, if you're willing to read widely and then compile your own inclusive way of working with things, I'd say there's a lot of new ideas and safety are available to you. But if you want to be looking at, simpler forms of this that really get to the heart of things and do something.
Amazing. I love it. What a great place to finish. Satyan, this has been an amazing conversation. Thanks for joining us on the Safety on Tap podcast.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Before you go, I've got a few takeaways to share with you from that chat with Satyan Chari. Takeaway number 1. I feel like the biggest turning point that Satyan shared in this conversation was the shift he made, not just to be more human oriented in his work, but to actively help people find their agency. It's not a word that we hear a lot, but it's very relevant to us. Agency refers to the capacity of individuals to obtain and to use power and resources to fulfill their potential. The opposite, which Satyan also mentioned, is when organizations and managers rob people of their agency. Notice the wording here. We are entitled to and we value agency as human beings. To take it away is stealing. The question for you is, does your organization and your approaches to safety develop the capacity for people to obtain and use resources to fulfill their potential? My experience suggests that this is a really secret weapon in your potential success. Takeaway number 2. Notice how casually Satyan said that he originally thought this and that, and then he realized some problems with that, and then he sought out new ideas and he changed his mind. He changed his mind. Can you believe it? An experienced, qualified PhD changed his mind. The sky did not cave in and nothing burst into flames. It's okay for you to change your mind if it's going to make you and your work better. Which raises two reflective questions. One, what have you changed your mind about in the past? And two, what should you seriously entertain changing your mind about right now that you haven't or you're afraid to? Takeaway number 3. He is putting ideas together, not staying in a single box. Concepts, tools, theories, practices, and philosophies are all getting mixed up. We can write a list. There's heaps of them that you heard today. Ergonomics, success at scale, randomized controlled trials, person-centered, going on a journey, ecological approaches, and a bunch of theories from other people. I originally asked Satyan to come on and talk about human factors and ergonomics. And he said no, he would rather talk about the intersection that Satyan is seeing between systems innovation and systems thinking and human factors and ergonomics. He's playing with and combining and recombining a bunch of things. The answers that you seek are never just in one place. You need a collection of ideas to bring together that make sense for you and your context. So the question is, can you describe your own collection of ideas that inform your work as diverse and as broad-ranging as Satyan's? Or do your ideas come from a limited number of sources? It might be time to get some ideas from other places and to see what happens when you mix them up and combine them. I promise that it will not fail to reward you. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, what's the one thing you'll do to take positive, effective, or rewarding action to grow yourself and drastically improve health and safety along the way? See ya.